Welcome back to the CSS Grid project where we're building the Holy Grail CSS layout. What you're seeing on the screen here with Flexbox and CSS Grid. And in this project, what we've already done is gone through the first two steps of this little presentation. So we got our coding environment set up and we got the boilerplate and external style sheets imported, all connected up and working. So if we came back to our Visual Studio Code, we've got this basic HTML document and we are ready to start creating the layout. If you haven't watched part one, go to the description. There's a playlist to my full stack roadmap series, which this CSS Grid course is kind of a subset of. So you can see that playlist. It'll take you through all of these in order. Before we start creating the layout, I want to review this four-step system for writing HTML and CSS. I covered this in a prior challenge video, kind of in our introduction to CSS and HTML, but I want to reiterate this four-step process because I think it's very helpful as you go to do these things on your own. So step one, wireframe and mockups. How should this design look and behave on different screen sizes? Luckily for us, or for you, I've already created this and we've got it open here and we can kind of play around and see exactly how it should look. So this is kind of step one there. Step two is what HTML structure do I need to achieve the design? So this is actually a tricky one and it kind of comes with experience and practice, but it's basically pointing at how do we make the containers and the children items within our HTML to achieve that layout that we're looking at visually. Then step three is how do we use CSS to achieve that? And this is where we're going to spend a lot of time in this video and is kind of the point of this entire project because we're going to use CSS Grid primarily to achieve the layout that you see on this screen right now. And we're going to use it to kind of make it responsive so that it looks good on all devices. And then the final step is adding these styles. So step four is kind of the fun part where we start adding colors and fonts and making everything come together how we want it to. So step number one is to create the main containers that we need for this. And what I've done in the style guide is linked to a picture here. So if you open the preview, you should see the picture show up. It's also here called Layout Starter. It's not very easy to see within Visual Studio Code. So let me open up Figma where I created it. And what we're working with is an outer grid and an inner grid. So if you look at these two designs here, the one on the left is kind of that outer skeleton that you might see if you were looking at this project live. So let's make it that desktop view and scroll to the top and you'll see that we have that header at the top, the nav bar on the left, and then everything else here in this main section. And that looks very similar to what we're seeing in the outer grid. So what we're going to do is create HTML and CSS to basically replicate this right here, what we're looking at. Once we've done that, then we will kind of say, okay, that part is done. Now let's move to the inner grid. So we're actually putting a CSS grid within a CSS grid. So this main section, this little portion here, is going to represent another grid, which is going to be split into three pieces on the widest layout. But enough talk, let's go ahead and start building this and you'll see exactly what I mean. We'll let's keep the style guide open and let me right click and split down. So the style guide will be at the very bottom of our screen and we can kind of resize that so that we have it available. Here's our index.html. We don't need script.js quite yet. And then style.css, let's split that to the right, close out the original. So now we have index.html on the left, style.css on the right, and our style guide with all the colors down here. We can click this button to close the navigation and give us some more room. In order to create this layout right here, we'll start with this big version. And what we're going to need is three div elements. So the top one, or not div elements, but three HTML elements that will be kind of the containers or the parent elements. So we need a header, a nav, and then just a regular div. So let's come into our HTML And what I'm going to use here are these foldable code tabs or whatever you call them, so that we can focus in on what we're trying to build rather than looking at all this stuff going on up here. So I'm going to collapse with this foldable thing, the head, so now you don't see all that stuff going on. And now when we come down into the body, we can kind of be distraction free. So the first thing we'll do is create a div called outer grid. And I'm using the Emmet snippets, where if you type a dot and then the class name, and press tab, it's going to make a div with that class that you just specified. Within that div, we're going to put those three elements. So the header, the nav on the left, and then the main content. So we'll say header, hit tab, we'll make a nav, hit tab. So these are semantic HTML elements. I covered this in a prior video. And then finally, we're going to want our inner grid as a div. So those are going to be the three elements that we're working with. And to start us off, I'm going to add some styles to these so that we can start to see them working on the page. So let's hit save. And if we flip back to our live version of this, you will not see anything going on because we haven't put anything into these containers yet. The first thing I want to do is turn this into a grid container. So in our style.css, we're going to say outer grid to select that element, and we'll set that to a display type of grid. We're also going to want to make this as tall as the viewport, so it's basically as tall as the screen, and we'll set the height as 100 VH, or 100% of the viewport height. Let's give it a background color of blue for a second and click save. And we'll come back to our document, and now you can see that our container is filling up the entire page. You'll also notice that there's a little bit of white space around the kind of corners of this, and that is because we haven't done our basic CSS reset yet. We always want to do that when we're starting our project. So at the very top, and I'm going to start making some sections here so that we stay organized with our code. So here's a comment, and we'll say shared CSS. And then below here, we're going to target all elements with that wildcard character. And we will do our CSS reset, which is going to set the box sizing to border box. We will set the margin to 0 and the padding to 0. When we hit save and come back, there's no more white space around this. There's no scroll bar because we have this grid container taking up the entire height of the screen, and it's by default going to span the entire width of the screen as well. I think so that we can see this live, I'm going to bring this code editor to the left. Hopefully we'll still have some room to work with. But I want to see these changes a little bit more real time. So right now we've got this localhost open into responsive mode, but since our screen is so small, I'm going to copy this to another tab just so that we can get full screen. And now what we're looking at is a full screen, just basic blue background with that container. The next thing I want to do is get each of these elements, so the header, the nav, and the inner grid. I want to give those some background color so that we can start to see this. So I will remove the background color on our outer grid because we don't really want to see anything there. But then we will come down to the header, the nav, and the inner grid, and we're going to give those background colors. So background color for the header, we actually have this within our style guide that's in the repository. So we want the outer grid header to be RGBA, so this is a transparent blue background. We'll put that in there, and when we click save, you'll see that popping up. The reason this is taking about 1/3 the height of the screen is because we enabled grid on its parent container. So now this is actually a grid item. By default, that's going to take up 1/3 of the height of its parent. Let's copy background color down to our nav. and our inner grid, and then replace those with our style guide. So the outer grid navbar is going to have the following color. And then the outer grid main area, it's actually the same color, just change the opacity, so we can just change that there. Click Save, and now you see our three colors popping up on the screen. Using just CSS Grid alone, we're going to take these three elements and turn them into what we see here in our Figma document, where we have the header, the nav on the left, and the main content. To keep us organized, I will make another section here. So we have shared CSS, which is going to be everything up there. Now we're going to say CSS Grid Styles will be our next section. And we can actually be specific. We'll say CSS Outer Grid Styles because we're going to have two grids in total. If we look at our Figma document, kind of that layout that we're trying to achieve here, you can see that in this outer grid, don't worry about anything on the right here yet. On the left here, the outer grid has the header and then, so basically two rows. It has the header, which is one row, and then the second row is going to be the nav bar and the main content. If you look at it from a column perspective, we obviously have two columns. So the header is taking up both of those columns at the top, and then the nav bar is taking up, looks like, or I actually know this off the top of my head, I think we set it to like 90 pixels is how far that's coming out. And then the remainder of the space, the remaining column, is going to be the main container. To achieve that with our CSS, we just have to come to the grid container and we'll say grid template rows is going to be 2 full rows. The first one is going to be, I believe, 70 pixels is how tall we want the header to be. So we'll say 70 pixels is the first row, and then 1 fractional unit is going to be the second one because we want to basically take up the remaining space within the grid container for that main content. The grid template columns should be 90 pixels, so that nav bar coming out on the left, and then 1 fractional unit to represent the rest of it. When we click Save, you will see that we're starting to get that layout. So we've got what it looks like that header is up there in the correct spot and then the nav bar on the left, but we still have a problem because we don't quite have our main content and we also have some overlap here in the top left corner. To fix that, we need to place our grid items. So I'm going to use the grid template areas method that we talked about, I believe, in the last video of the grid course. So we need to name each of these child or grid items. I'm going to call this alias header, just so that we're not getting confused with the HTML tag. So that will be alias header, then we'll have alias nav, and then finally the grid area will be alias inner grid. So we'll click Save, it's going to format it, and everything's going to disappear because we haven't placed those yet. At this point, let's look at our grid. So there's nothing on the page, as you can see, but if we look at our responsive mode, or actually no, we want to look at this mode right here. So once again, all three of these tabs are the same thing. They're all just our document that we're trying to create. They just have different DevTool configurations. So on this configuration, if we open up the body and click on the outer grid, and then we expand this section in the DevTools and click outer grid, you'll see that it gets highlighted on the page here. And then furthermore, you can hover over the grid in the DevTools to see the different sections of that grid. So the first thing we want to do is set the header to equal this top section and this top right section. The way that we do that is type out grid template areas, and since we have 2 total rows, we're going to need 2 quotation marks because each one's going to represent a row, and then within that, since we have 2 columns, we need 2 arguments. We can use these aliases, the grid areas, to specify those. So in the top row, we want the alias header to show up twice to span the entire width of that row. The bottom section, we want the nav on the left and then the inner grid on the right. So we'll type in alias nav and alias inner grid, put our semicolon at the end, and when we click save and come back, you will now see that everything looks great. So we have the header at the top, the nav on the left, and the inner grid in that main portion of the content. And since we said display area names, it's giving us those grid area aliases that we had set. So if you go back to our main layout here without the dev tools, this looks exactly like the Figma document that we just looked at. Now what you'll notice with this outer grid, we're not quite done yet. In the desktop view, it looks great. Tablet view looks great. Now in this mobile view, I've put two of them here, and that's to represent the two different states that we have with our final product. So if we resize this to be a mobile device, we have this little toggle area where we can open up that nav bar and close it by clicking. So we want to capture both of those states within our main layout. We don't want them to be obviously active at the same time, but we'll use JavaScript to toggle that back and forth. So the question is, how do we take this and with just CSS, take this nav bar and kind of hide it to the left? Since we want the ability to toggle back and forth, we can't just come in here and change it like this. So what we could do is we could just say alias inner grid, and now the nav's not going to show up when we click save. Now it's gone, and it's actually down here in the bottom right corner. If we were to make the nav a little bit larger, so we'll give it 50 pixels of height and width. And when we click save, in the bottom right corner of our page, that's where that's sitting, kind of gets knocked off the grid. So when we're in this state where we have a full page layout without that nav bar, we need to not only set the grid template areas to be this, we also need to hide the nav. So what we can do is say display and set that to none. So just like we can display a grid, we can also change the display mode to none, which means kind of make it disappear from the page. When I click save, you'll notice that this little box is going to disappear. And now this layout right here is exactly what we are looking for in that mobile state by default. Only when we click the icon that does not exist yet do we want that nav bar to come out on the mobile view. At this point, I want to stop for just a moment and kind of backtrack and explain something that you might be wondering. So we've been building this layout, and I've shown you the Figma document that I laid out with the outer and the inner grid, but you might be wondering, how did you know to do that? How did you look at this final design right here and figure out that that's what we need? And likewise, how do you, I'm about to show you something in order to toggle this navigation, you're also going to wonder the same thing, how do you know to do that? The reason that I know how to do this is because, number one, I've already built this, so I've gone through the trial and error process of, okay, this works, that doesn't work, this is a better design, and I've rebuilt it so that it's kind of what makes sense to me in my head. Furthermore, I have a little bit of experience doing it, so I've seen similar layouts, and I kind of remember and recall some of the patterns that we've used or I've used in the past to build those. So I just wanted to kind of break here to give you some confidence that this doesn't come naturally. You have to build stuff and experiment with things, and sometimes you have to build your layout 2 or 3 times before you get it to the point where you want it. All right, with that said, let me show you how we're going to toggle this back and forth. So let's go to our main layout here. And what we will do is actually add a conditional class. So if you think about with JavaScript in the document object model, we can actually toggle a class on and off from an HTML element with JavaScript. So what we can do is set an outer grid expanded class, and the only thing that that's going to do is take this grid template areas and make that nav bar expand out. So we're going to replace alias inner grid with alias nav. And let's see, before I refresh this, I want to think what I'm doing here. Yep, so let's hit save. And since this does not exist on any of our HTML, it's not going to affect it. But if we add that class, so outer grid expanded, to that main outer grid HTML element or container, and once we click save, it's going to show up here on the right side. The reason it's white is because we actually are not displaying the nav, so let's comment out these little rules that we just wrote for demonstration. Click save, and now we've got that back. So basically what's happening here, let's open this up, and we'll go back to this view right here. And if I target the HTML, I think there's a way we can toggle the classes on and off. Yeah, so if you come over this .cls and hover, it says toggle classes. So what we're going to want to do is, we've already got our outer grid selected. We'll click this .cls and you'll see the two classes that we are working with. So if we take the outer grid expanded off, you'll see that that goes away, and when we click it back, it comes back. So that's the exact behavior that we want when we click that icon at the top that we haven't yet created. But that's just to show you kind of how we're approaching this, the strategy that we're using. So we're going to use JavaScript to do what I'm doing here in the dev tools. I'm just toggling the class on and off. Now, of course, if we come back to our CSS and we go back to the nav element, I'm going to keep the display none off for a second and click save. We'll come back to the browser, and you can see we've got 50 pixels for that navigation header. And when I toggle the outer grid expanded off, you'll see that that goes to the bottom right, which is not what we want. We want it to disappear completely. To take care of that, we need another class. So we will come right under our conditional outer grid expanded class, and we'll make a hide nav class. And we're just going to set that to display none. And let's see, how do we want to do this? So if we put this onto the nav, so we'll say hide nav will be the default class, then by default we're going to get that totally expanded view, which is what we want on a mobile device. Since we are doing this in a mobile first approach, so what I said we're doing is a mobile first approach to responsive design, which means that all of these styles that we're creating right now should apply to the mobile device, and then later we're going to write some media queries to override those. So the actual correct thing to do here is apply this class by default to the navigation. And by default, we don't want the outer grid expanded class. But just for one more second here, I'm going to save this, save the HTML, and now we'll come back here. So you'll see that the nav is actually disabled, or it's not displaying on the screen. And the reason you're still seeing that is because I have the outer grid expanded showing. So once we toggle that, it's going to be in our mobile view. So this is exactly what we want for the mobile view. And then once we go to the larger view, we're going to display the nav and toggle on the outer grid expanded class. It's really hard to explain this, so let's just do it. And we're going to make this smaller, and we're going to need to open up our script.js file, and I will split this down, close the editor, and now we have our script.js in the bottom left, style.css on the right, and index.html. So by default, we want this outer grid expanded. We don't want that. Don't want that on the outer grid, so let's save that. So here's our default mobile view. This is exactly what we want. We are hiding the navigation, and we are showing an outer grid that has just the header and then the content. So going back to our final design, just to prove that out to you. Here's the final design. If we refresh, this is the default view. So header, main content. In order to toggle something, we need a button to work with. So we will jump a little bit ahead in the tutorial and add that icon. The way that we do that, if we come to Font Awesome, or actually no, we've got this in the style guide. So where's the style guide? It's at the bottom here. I've got this open, and the header menu is going to be this link. So control click, we'll pop that open into another tab. So this is the icon that we want, and we just need to use this HTML. So we can just click it to copy. Within the header, we will paste that and click save. And now our layout's going to have this little button. It's not going to be aligned correctly or the correct color. That's fine. We just need it there so that we can test our JavaScript. On that icon, we want to add an on-click listener. So this enables us to execute a function every time the user clicks it, which is what we want. In our script.js, let's change the name of this function to toggle nav, and let's invoke that function in the on-click listener. So let's save the HTML, save the script, and when we click this button, you'll see a dialog box that says the JS is working. So what we want to have happen when we click this, this is the default state. When we click that, we want to add to this outer grid, the outer grid expanded class, and then we want to remove the hide nav from the navigation element. So two things that we're toggling. Luckily, there is a method that's built into the DOM that allows us to do this very easily. Let's go to MDN for documentation. I'll expand this out a little bit. And you probably would not know where to go. The most reasonable solution would be how to toggle a class. Just type that into Google, but I'll show you exactly where we need to go. So there's something called a class list, which is attached to an element. So if we click on the element, we should get a list of the classes that are on it. Now, if we go way back to our video on the DOM, the way that we get to there is by selecting our elements. So that's step one. In our function, we want to grab the outer grid, and we do that by saying document.querySelector, and we want to select the element that has a class of outer grid. From there, we can then console.log the outer grid.class list. So what this should do is select from the DOM the element with outer grid and then print its class list, which in this case is just one single class. Let's save that. So now we don't have an alert anymore, but if we come up to one that we have open, okay, this works right here. We'll go to the console, and now we will, actually, let's turn off these area names for a second. We'll go to the console and we'll click this button up here. When we click it, you'll see in the right, we have printed something called a DOM token list, which is the, data type that, or the DOM data type that it's going to return from this property. That particular data type, so there's our one class. If you click on DOM token list and you go to the methods right here, we have something called toggle. So what this does, it says the toggle method of the DOM token list removes a given token from the list and returns false. If the token doesn't exist, it's added and the function returns true. So as you might expect, it toggles it. So let's put this by the side here again. And now what we're going to do is say outer grid.class list. So that's going to return us that DOM token list. And then we invoke the toggle method on there. And then the only argument that we pass to it, if we go to the documentation, it says our first parameter is going to be a token, a DOM string representing the token you want to toggle. And this can be a class or it can be other sorts of tokens. We're using the class in this instance. So the class that we want to toggle when we click this is going to be the outer grid expanded class. So we'll copy that in, put it in there as a string, and now we can get rid of that console log and save our script. And now what's going to happen when we click this is it's going to expand the nav menu. So let's click it. You can see that it expands something out, but there's no nav menu. and that's because we haven't toggled the hide nav class. It's still hiding the navigation, so we have to do the same thing that we did right here with the nav. So let's copy all of this code down, and we'll set a variable equal to nav. We want to select the nav element, so that this line will select it and save it into a variable. Then we can come down here, grab that nav right here, and take the class list and toggle what we call the hide nav class. So we'll save that, and now when we click this, we should see the navigation popping up here, and then when we click it again, it will collapse. The reason it looks so weird is this little box is because over in our CSS, we're still giving the nav an explicit height of 50 by 50. So let's delete all of this stuff. We don't need it anymore. Click Save, and I believe we should be completed or done with our outer layout. Just to make sure this is working, we'll refresh the page here. So this is our default state on mobile, and when we click this hamburger icon, it's going to toggle out the nav. We click it again, it's going to toggle it back. At this point, our next step is to make this responsive. So we've got a fully functioning navigation, but as you can see, if we refresh it here on this super wide screen, we want to show the nav by default. So if you see in our final view, we're not showing the nav here. As we resize, it shows up, and then as it gets bigger, it kind of just stays there. So this would be a great time to start writing our media queries. So here's the final project, and as you see, it resizes as we resize the device. So the three media queries that I've written would be 576, so you can watch this width up here at the top. So 576, the nav bar shows up. At 992, the sidebar shows up. And at 1440, the whole layout kind of shifts to the middle. I talked about this in a previous tutorial in this full stack roadmap series, but the way that I chose those breakpoints is by going to Bootstrap's breakpoints. So these are kind of arbitrary decisions. So I just used kind of a tried and trusted CSS framework. The 1440 I didn't use, but I used the 576 and the 992. So that would be a mobile, a tablet, a desktop, and a large desktop is what we're designing for. To set this up, let's come to our style.css. Let's grab one of these section comments, put these down at the bottom, and say that we want breakpoints. We will start by writing @media, so this is a CSS @ rule. We talked about this in our responsive design video. So @media, and then we set a min width because we're doing this mobile first. So we created all these styles above, which apply to the mobile device, and then conditionally, once we get to these larger sizes, so anything greater than this width that I'm about to set of 576 pixels, we're going to apply the styles within this block. We can copy this down because we know we're going to need 2 more of these. So the next one will be 992 and then 1440. We'll save that, not going to do anything quite yet, but if we jump back to our layout here, the first thing we want to do, this view is fine. Actually, let's look at this one so we can resize it. So this is fine, but once we hit 576, I want that nav bar to show up. An easy way to do that is come into our first media query rule, and we say that we want to target the nav element, and we say display block. Now, by default, this is not going to work because we've actually we've got a more specific CSS rule above. So this would be a case where putting the important keyword is going to be helpful. So we want to override that default behavior. We'll click Save. And now as we resize it, you're not going to see anything because just displaying the nav is not going to do anything. I should have known that. We want to grab this outer grid expanded rule, so the grid template areas, and apply that as well. Actually, that's just a CSS rule, so we want to target the outer grid and then paste those in. Once we hit save on this, come back to our design, And as we resize, now you're seeing that nav bar just show up by default. We also want to remove this little icon at the top, because once the nav bar is showing by default, we don't want the user to click to try to toggle it on and off, and it doesn't do anything anyway. So to do that, we'll come in the same rule, and we will say that we want the FA bars class, so we can target this icon by using one of its classes, and this will be the unique class that won't apply to any other icon. So we'll say display none. Let's hit save, and now you see that that's gone. So we're on a mobile device. We can toggle our nav back and forth. Let's toggle it off. Now as we resize, the nav shows up and that icon goes away. And as we hit greater breakpoints, that same behavior is going to apply. So setting these rules right here, we can basically cover anything greater than 576, and therefore we don't need these rules in these last two breakpoints. We'll come back to these. We don't have enough content in our document, our HTML document, to even worry about them yet. But at this point, we are fully complete with our outer grid. So this is the kind of the shell container for everything else. In our Figma document, we have pretty much created and completed the outer grid here. Now we need to move to the inner grid. So the inner grid is going to be everything that we put within this div that I've highlighted right here. So we can collapse everything else. We can collapse the header for now. I guess there's really nothing else to collapse without collapsing the inner grid itself. We'll come up to our CSS, grab this label and put it below. In this rule right here, the inner grid, we use this to set a background color and also the grid area, because this is a nice distinction to make. The inner grid is a grid item to the outer grid, but it's going to be a grid container to its direct children. We'll take this CSS rule and copy that down into the, not outer, but inner grid styles. And now what we want to do is come down and say display grid. So we want to turn this grid item into a grid and a grid item. We also need to figure out what goes in this, so what HTML is going to actually sit there. In our Figma document, you can see there are three pieces. We have the main content, we have a sidebar, and we have a footer down here. So if we come back to our HTML, we will first put in a main tag, and I'm actually going to put in something called an article tag. You'll see how this helps just with some simple padding later. So we're going to make a main tag, and then we can actually collapse that. We don't need to worry about that article yet. Then we have the aside element. So the aside will represent the sidebar. And finally, we need a footer element. Let's also come to our CSS and set up some styles for all of these. So we have main, aside, and footer. We'll throw both of these, grid area and background color, onto each of these. And then we'll update them accordingly. So this will be alias main. This will help with our grid template areas once we set those on the parent container. So alias aside, and finally alias footer. If we open up our style guide, which is kind of hanging out at the bottom here, I also have the inner grid colors, the background colors that we need. So the first one, the main content, is going to be this orange color. So we'll replace that there. Then we want a more transparent orange color. And then the final one just ups the transparency a little bit. So we'll copy that in, change that to 0.7, and click save on the style.css and a save on the index.html. Let's flip back to not our Figma document, but our challenge itself. You'll see that it looks a little bit weird. This is going to be fixed as we place these items on the grid. So let's look at it from a grid perspective. So if we select this, we're selecting the footer here, but let's click on the inner grid. And when we unselect the outer grid and select the inner grid, now we can see that by default it's got just a 2x2 grid because we didn't actually define it. We've just got some items in it. So if we flip back to see what we need to create, it looks like in the widest version we need 2 rows. So the top 2 pieces will be row 1 and the footer will be row 2. And then we'll have 2 columns. So if we come back to our CSS, let's go to the inner grid style. This is the grid container. So we set grid template rows, and I said there's 2 of those. Let's look at the amount of space that they take up. So the main content, the first row, should span all of the remaining space that there is left after we give the footer some dimensions. To specify that, all we need to do for the rows is 1 fractional unit, and then we need to put in 60 pixels is how big the height is for the footer. And then for the grid template columns, this one's going to be a little bit different. So if we look at our Figma document in this biggest version, there's going to be 2 columns. And this isn't readily apparent, but I'm going to make this main column, which is going to have the main article in it. We're going to set that to a maximum width of 700 pixels so that the user is not reading an article and has to track, all the way to the right side of the screen on bigger devices. And then this aside will take up the remaining space. So the way that we're going to do that is actually using something called a min-max function. We talked briefly about this in previous videos on this grid tutorial, but basically we can give it 2 arguments, the minimum width that we want and the maximum. So minimum is going to be the content width. We'll just set it to auto. Maximum, like I said, is going to be 700 pixels. And then the next argument is going to be the second column. So what we just defined was the dimensions of that first column. Then the second column is going to be 1 fractional unit, which is the remaining space. You can now see that our inner grid that we have checked here, so we can check both actually, and now we have the outer and the inner, but uncheck the outer, and now you can see that we've got the main content here, and then the aside over here, and then the 2 little footer areas. But at the moment, we don't have these elements laid out, so let's go back to our CSS and type out the grid template areas. Since we have 2 rows, we need 2 of these little quotations, so that's the structure, and we have 2 columns, so we need 2 arguments for each. So the first one is going to be the alias main. The second one is alias aside. So that for that first row that spans the entire remaining height, we have the main and the aside, and then we have the alias footer spanning across the entire bottom row. Let's hit save. We'll come back, keep flipping to the wrong one. And now you can see I've got the area names selected in the inner grid. And you can see that the alias main is sitting here, the aside is over here, and the footer's at the bottom. So ultimately, let's look at the this version. Oh, I've made a big mistake down here. So this is invalid CSS. We need to add RGBA at the beginning. That's why we were experiencing an error. That should fix things a little bit. All right, so now it's looking better. So we have this outer grid area that we created earlier. Now we have the inner grid area, which is actually a subgrid of one of the outer grid items. This looks great, but we do have one problem. As we resize this, go to our mobile device, it's not exactly doing what we want. So it looks like the aside element is just completely disappearing on a mobile device. That is because what we just did was a version of desktop first design. We need to do a mobile first design. So if we come back to Figma, what we really should be trying to figure out is how do we create this little layout down in the bottom right. So we'll open up our CSS, and since this is the desktop version, we'll take all of these definitions right here and copy them, and then we want those to apply starting at this breakpoint here. So we'll paste those in here, And then of course these need to be part of a selector. So let's paste those in there, get rid of this, and click Save. So now it will apply on anything greater than 992. And we can come up to the top and on our mobile device, which is the default, mobile first, we need to change this up a little. So the rows are actually going to be 3 total rows. So we look at our design here, we have a section here, down here, and at the bottom. We know that the footer is going to be 60 pixels, so we can keep that. We know that the main content, the first one, is going to take the remaining space. And then in the middle, this will be a sidebar. We want that to be the size of its content. So to do that, we can just put in auto. So now we have the top row is going to take up remaining space. The middle row or the second row is going to be the size of that sidebar. And then the final row is going to be the footer, which is 60 pixels. Now, I'll have you notice that we have not put anything in the sidebar. So since it's set to auto, it's going to collapse to be pretty much 0 height. So when we click Save on this, that's what's going to happen. Furthermore, the columns is only going to be 1. So we just get rid of that min-max. The columns is just going to be 1 column and it's going to take up all of the space. Finally, for the grid template areas, we just want the alias main to be the first row. We need to copy one down because we have 3 rows, and then we'll replace these 2 with a side, and then the final one will be footer. So these are going to be the mobile styles. Let's hit save. Go back to our layout, and you can see that it has worked. And as I mentioned, the sidebar has no dimensions, so it's kind of collapsed here between the top and the bottom one. If we came back to our CSS, went to our side element and gave it a height of 100 pixels and hit save, then when we come back, you can see that it has popped up right here, and we're looking a lot closer to this, or actually exactly like this layout. And since we already gave it those media query styles, so once we get above 992, we're going to change that grid layout to be what we created in the first place. So now we can resize things, and you'll see how that changes. Right there, we got it to size over there, and you see this blue space. That's because this sidebar, we told it to, we gave it 100 pixels, so it's not expanding to fit that entire grid area. So if we come back to here and get rid of that height, hit save and come back, now it's going to take up the entire height. And that's it. We are done with the layout section, and I'm pretty happy with what we've created. This is a robust layout. We know that it's going to be intact when we start adding content, and it's really smart to go through and create this the first time around, and then you start adding content once you're confident that the layout is going to work how you intend. So just to review, we've got it at the mobile size, full content, got a footer down here, a header. We hit this button, it toggles out the navbar, which goes to the bottom. Then we hit it again and it collapses. Now the last thing we need to do before we're completely finished with the layout is handle a case where this main content is taller than the visible screen. And that's a very real possibility. If you're dealing with this layout, you probably have blog posts, and a blog post does not fit on one screen. You always have to scroll down through it. So if we go to our CSS and we give the main content a height of 2000 pixels, that's very reasonable. We'll hit save, come back, and now you see there's this little scroll bar on the right. Let's get out of our responsive mode for a second. You see here's our scroll bar, and we're scrolling down, but what's happening is everything is scrolling down at the same time. We want to actually leave this header up at the top as we're scrolling down so that the header and then the nav bar are kind of just sticky there, and they just sit as that outer template. This is actually a lot easier to fix than you might think. All we have to do is take this inner content, the main content, and set an overflow property on it. So to do that, we'll come to the inner grid, and we'll just set this at the very top. So we'll say overflow is going to be set to scroll. Once we hit save on that, we come back, and now as we scroll, you'll see that we're scrolling up and down here, but the outer template is staying in place, and that's exactly what we want. You'll also notice there's a scroll bar on the horizontal direction. We don't want that, so to fix it, all we have to do is take this overflow property and say -y. So this is a completely different CSS property that only sets the overflow in the vertical direction. Hit save on that, go back to our layout. Now that bottom scroll bar left and right is gone, and I'm pretty happy with this layout at this point. So we're done. We are completely done with the layout, and if we go back to our video outline, we have gotten our environment set up, got our boilerplate, and we built a mobile-first responsive layout with the JavaScript toggle functionality. All three of these steps took us, I think, well over an hour. I'm not exactly sure the recording time at this point, but that's honestly the hardest part in most CSS and HTML layouts. Once you've got this set up, you're ready to go, and for the remainder of this tutorial and the next video or two, we're going to just kind of fly through this and get some Flexbox styles, get some content in there, and really start changing things to make it look like our final product. Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, maybe leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next video.